Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture. This week we focus on family and how the Latinx family has been discussed within and outside of Latino studies. So, according to the reading, the Latinx population is often described as being family-oriented and having family values. The Latinx family, however, has been described as pathological and broken by social scientists in past decades. The family has also been used as an ideal concept, as a unifying concept for different Latinx populations during different time periods, like during the Chicano movement. And more recently, a major issue having to do with the Latinx family is family separation. So this idea of Latinx as being family-oriented, part of it is how many Latinos define family in a different way, in a larger way than just the nuclear family, including extended family, friends, and so on. There's also the system of compadrazgo, which expands family dynamics. Compadrazgo means godparents, usually through Catholicism. Children are baptized and have godparents. And so the godparents become members of the family as well. But this idea of all Latinos being family-oriented gets challenged when we look more closely at certain family dynamics where the acceptance by one's family is not always unconditional. And we certainly have a lot of anecdotal stories of people being excluded from their family for different reasons, including one's sexuality. Now, during the 1960s, social scientists became very interested in studying families of color, particularly African-American and Latinx families, to try to understand why these populations were remaining in poverty. And so a number of studies and reports like the Moynihan report came out as a result of these studies and promoted this idea of culture of poverty, where essentially the explanation became that these populations were poor because these groups had a certain culture where they remained in poverty. And these elements of the family were identified as the elements that contributed to these populations remaining in poverty. These reports included images of mothers as being bad mothers, ineffective mothers, and sexually promiscuous, families where men were emasculated and therefore were unpresent, and also the presence of illegitimate children. So during this time period, the Latinx family was not perceived in a positive light, but was targeted as something that needed to be quote unquote fixed and needed to be assimilated into American middle class ideas of the family in order for supposedly these populations to be able to come out of poverty. As a response, from the Chicano community in particular, family became a unifying concept as a way to unite members of the community. The reading also talked about this among Puerto Ricans as a way to define the Puerto Rican nation as a unified family. From the Chicano perspective, during the Chicano movement, they often talked about liberating Chicanos through the liberation of the Chicano family. So the family as a whole needed to be liberated, needed to come out of oppression. But it upheld traditional definitions of the family, with a family patriarch being in his place, and certain gender roles within the family still being upheld. So this idea of the family was often critiqued, particularly by Chicana feminists and other Latina feminists. We also saw in the reading how, as a result of some of their experiences with their own family members, queer Latinos go outside of their biological families or nuclear families to create their own sense of family. The reading also talked about transnational families, and we have seen this in the last few decades with immigration, where these are families that are separated, where the adults, for example, leave their children behind in their home countries and come to the United States with the plan of working here, saving money, and perhaps bringing the children to the United States. But that takes some time or never actually happens. And so there are many Latinx families that function within this dynamic where the family is split between two countries. These parents work in the US and often send money to children left behind in their countries of origin. And there are multiple studies that have found how many of these families struggle financially because they're not only maintaining households in the United States, but also maintaining their households back in their countries of origin. There's also a number of studies on how parenting transnationally is challenging because of the distance between the children and their parents, where often the children, depending on the length of their separation, really don't pay attention to their parents, or it's difficult for the parent to sort of uphold certain disciplinary rules and so on, because they're just not present, right? This kind of impact on the children-parent relationship is also impacted in those families where they are able to at some point reunite, where the parents are able to bring the children to the United States. But by that point, there's been several years of distance. And so those relationships are impacted as well. Finally, the reading talked about a more recent issue that we've seen in the news of family separation, where children are separated from undocumented parents in detention centers or via deportations, where children, particularly US-born children, are left behind while their parents are deported, and the kinds of trauma and strains that are created as a result of these separations, as we saw in the article that we read for this week. So the reading talked about how US citizen children are impacted by family separation, the trauma resulting from the separation, including things like nightmares, not being able to sleep well, and so on, as we saw in the article with the example of David, who spent time in foster homes, separated from his parents. There was one discussion of one of the earlier foster homes where he was at, where he spoke Spanish and no one around him spoke Spanish. So there's also sort of this imposition of silence and the impact of that. And then we also have those mixed families living in the United States, where parents are undocumented, but the children are American citizens, and sort of the constant stress that these families live under, where the parents are, both parents and children are constantly in fear that they will be separated at some point. So these are the numerous issues that within Latinx studies you see addressed in studies of the family, and the more nuanced ways of looking at the Latinx family and studying and understanding how family dynamics under these various circumstances are impacted and might be different from mainstream families. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to the discussion post. Have a great week.